And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Christopher. I know you have a long-standing interest in the topic of these regulations, and I'm pleased that you'll be overseeing the debate today. Each year, hundreds of millions of pounds are spent on exit payments to public sector workers that exceed £100,000. The money funding these payments comes from taxpayers. This statutory instrument will fulfil the government's 2015 manifesto commitment to end six-figure payoffs by capping public sector exit payments at £95,000. I'll just make a little progress and then, of course, I'll take a motion. The concern over high exit payments is shared by many, in fact, across the House. For example, the member for Worley on the benches opposite said in the House as recently as the 13th of March 2020, the honourable gentleman is rightly drawing attention to a significant problem. Is there not another aspect to it, which is that many of these individuals, quite frankly, should not be given any payments because they should actually be sacked for failure to perform their jobs. They are taking sums of money and then transferring to other parts of the public sector where they will have a repeated pattern of failure. Is there not a need for a real change in culture? That was a view expressed on the benches opposite. I'm sure it is one shared by many other colleagues in the House. Public sector workers play a vital role in the running of our economy. Earlier this year, we accepted the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies and announced a significant real terms pay increase for around 900,000 public sector workers. But we must ensure that all aspects of public sector pay and remuneration deliver value for money for the taxpayer. There are many recent examples of employees leaving their role and receiving six-figure packages funded by the taxpayer. And it is our view, Sir Christopher, that these large exit payments do not deliver that aim, not least given the wider economic impact of coronavirus. Of course, I could work.
Thank you, Chair. I thank the Minister for giving way. And whilst I don't think there is disagreement on the need to tackle the excessive exit payments, why is the government choosing to include harassment and discrimination payments in the scope of what it's seeking to do?
Well, I will come on to the distinction between those on large payments where I think there's a degree of consensus in the House, and then how the waivers will address some of the concerns that I know he and other members opposite expressed in the previous debate when we looked at this. So I will come on to this in my remarks if he just gives me a moment. And of course, if he then wants to come back with an intervention, very happy to accept that. Exit payments are important to an employer's ability to reform and react to new circumstances. They are also an important source of support for individuals as they find new employment or as a bridge until retirement age. That is why the government is taking forward these important regulations to cap public sector exit payments at £95,000. The level of the cap amounts to almost 6 times the maximum statutory redundancy payment. On an average salary of £24,897, the average person would have to work almost 4 years to earn £95,000. While someone working 35 hours a week on the national living wage would have to work around 6 years to earn £95,000, and that ignores the fact that the first £30,000 is paid tax-free. As such, it is clear that this cap at £95,000 will still offer a significant level of compensation whilst ensuring value for money for the public finances. In fact, I think the majority of our constituents would regard it as a generous amount. Of course.
I thank the Minister for giving way. He's talked about trying to address some concerns today. What can he tell members in this House at the moment about how he's going to address the concerns expressed by the nuclear workers who were given specific guarantees about their pensions, and these guarantees have repeatedly been overridden?
I very much welcome that intervention because that was one of the concerns actually raised by a number of members opposite when we previously debated this in the House, and we have agreed a waiver that will apply to nuclear decommissioning as part of this regulation. So as an illustration of how we have listened to some of the concerns of members opposite, and I come on to the wider point in terms of how the waiver application will apply, but I think the exemption that applies to nuclear decommissioning illustrates that what we have done is take on board some of the concerns that members raised last time. Now, I'm grateful, Sir Christopher, to all members of the public, employers, unions and others who submitted their views as part of the consultation process. The consultation in April 2019 received over 600 responses, and these responses helped inform the final regulations following the earlier consultation in 2015, which had over 4,000 responses. And I'm also grateful to many of my right honourable friends for their representations during the development of these policies. The government's intention was made clear at the start, which was to apply the cap to all public sector workers. As the 2015 consultation stated, all bodies classified within central and local government are non-financial public corporation sectors as determined by the Office for National Statistics for national account purposes, with a small number of exceptions. And the 2019 consultation, which said the government is proposing a staged process of implementation across the public sector. The first stage will capture most public sector employees before extending the cap to the rest of the public sector in the second stage. Prioritising in this way will ensure most exit payments in the public sector are limited to 95,000 without further delay, while work continues on expanding the scope of the regulations. Now, to ensure fairness and consistency, Sir Christopher, and give taxpayers confidence that their money is being spent properly, it is right that all public sector bodies are immediately in scope, with very limited exceptions such as the one I just referred to. The consultation in 29 proposed capturing public sector bodies in 2 stages, and many of the responses objected to this proposal. We have therefore revised that proposal and reverted to applying the cap to all public sector bodies at once. The government's intention to cap exit payments has now been in the public domain for over 5 years, and providing public sector bodies and employers with sufficient time to communicate their views, including through the consultation process, and to prepare for the implementation of the cap. Of course I can.
I thank the Minister for giving way. The Minister makes a point about fairness and says that this has been in the public domain since 2015. Why then has there been no equality impact assessment undertaken, and how many people are affected, and when will the government provide the EQIA?
Well, it depends on different circumstances as to how many people will be affected, but I think one of the key issues is the fact that these proposals do not affect individuals' accrued pension rights. And one of the concerns raised in the debate previously, again, was in terms of the impact on pension rights. And again, that is one of the issues we have listened to and taken on board. So firstly, it's important to note that accrued pension rights are not affected by these regulations. And in the vast majority of cases, the cap will have no effect on the exit package of an individual, because individuals retain any right to receive an unreduced pension providing their overall exit payment falls below the cap on £95,000, which applies in most cases. However, the government believes it is right to include all payments related to exit within the scope of the cap. The option of an employer-funded early retirement, known as pension top-up payments, is often the most costly element of an exit payment, and it is ultimately funded by the taxpayer, so it is right that it is included. Of course, I give a third.
Thank the Minister for being generous. It says all payments will be taken into scope, but this means that, for example, a very practical example, in Birmingham, women were receiving unequal pay for many, many years, and in the 174 women took the case to the Supreme Court, they won, and their payments for some full-time care workers would have been over £100,000 just to catch up on the unequal pay they'd experienced for many decades of service in a difficult job. Why is the government including that in this regulation?
Well, I agree with him. And that is one of the points that I took away from the previous debate. Is one of the points, Sir Christopher, that I was concerned that we showed the House we had listened to. And in fact, the very next line of my speech, if I may say, was, I do accept that in some circumstances it will be appropriate for employees to receive an exit payment over £95,000. And I was then going to, well, I'm always generous, I think, Sir Christopher, taking intervention. I was trying to answer the honourable gentleman's very legitimate challenge, but I'll, of course, take the intervention.
Just ask the Minister, just for purposes of clarity, is he saying today that he's going to exempt nuclear decommissioning workers? And if that is the case, we have Magnox on this list here, so unless the Minister has been very clear and I've not listened properly, I wondered if you could clarify that point.
So nuclear decommissioning authority workers, in terms of their pension, I'm very happy to share with her the detail of that waiver, but the waiver will apply in respect of the nuclear decommissioning authority, and that includes, if she allows me to answer the question, I was actually going to read out the exact legal prose. Sometimes we're accused of not being precise enough, Sir Christopher. I'm actually going to go straight to the legal text for the Honourable Lady, which says, made to or on behalf of an employee who is employed by a company or other body holding a site licence granted under the Nuclear Installations Act 1965 for one or more nuclear licensed sites, and on a site that is subject to a decommissioning programme agreed by the NDA and the Bay Secretary of State, and whose employment is terminated and details accordingly. So there is an option there. But to come back to the Honourable Gentleman, because I have, and in fact the Honourable Lady who hasn't as yet spoken for Newcastle, not Central, Newcastle North, again, in the previous debate, spoke about her acceptance of the wider principle of exit cap payments, but had some concerns in there. So, we have sought to look and to listen at the concerns that members opposite raised. And so I do accept, Sir Christopher, that there are some circumstances where it's appropriate for employees to receive an exit payment over £95,000, including where imposing the cap will cause genuine hardship. We committed to ending taxpayer-funded six-figure payouts for the best-paid public sector workers, but it is appropriate that the waiver system can be exercised with ministerial discretion if it is felt that implementing the cap would go against the original principles and result in hardship. The waiver, well, let me just finish the point, Ellen. The waiver may also be used to give effect to urgent workplace reforms. It applies where a payment is made as a result of the application of TUPE regulations, or where a payment is made to settle a grievance relating to whistleblowing, discrimination, or health and safety-related dismissal. This mechanism is very important in allowing us to review how the cap is being applied and ensure we are staying consistent with our original aims for these regulations. I hope this system will address many questions my honourable friends may have. If you want to come in one final time.
I thank you, Minister. And it is a clarification on the waiver process. Is the government intent to make it the case that a local authority has to seek permission from a minister in the department to honour a legally decided case of discrimination and make the payment that a court has ordered? Is that the process that local authorities and other public bodies will have to follow?
It's a very valid question. So, for example, if I take a whistleblower case, in that instance there is no requirement on the local authority to submit a business case for approval. There are mandatory courses for exemption. But in the case where a discretionary exemption is sought, such as on a restructuring, then it is necessary to submit a business case. And when he shakes his head, I simply remind, as a minister, I constantly get requests when bodies want to exceed the £150,000 payment. They're quite happy to submit business requests for that. So I don't see that it is onerous to say that the same applies in terms of seeking consent when looking to restructure and exempt in that way. In other parts of the United Kingdom, Sir Christopher, devolved administrations have already acted to implement their own policy on severance payments. The Scottish Government has implemented a £95,000 cap on payments made by devolved bodies by updating the Scottish Public Finance Manual. It is right that this Parliament does the same thing by approving these regulations. As we respond to the financial impacts of COVID-19, the inappropriateness of large exit payments is reinforced. Ensuring that rewards are proportionate and taxpayer money is spent fairly must be prioritised. The regulations are carefully designed to end excessive exit payments and will come into force 21 days after they are made. I commend these regulations, Sir Christopher, to the committee.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Restriction of Public Sector Exit Payments Regulations 2020. Wes Street.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Look, while no one believes that huge exit payments from the public sector are right, and it's an issue that needs to be addressed, we are concerned about the way in which the government is going about implementing these regulations, which are unnecessary, premature, unhelpful, place burdens on the public sector that are disproportionate to the purpose they seek to ensure, and in some cases present perverse disincentives too. Sir Christopher, just to outline those points in more detail this afternoon, the Chief Secretary in particular referred to regulations implemented on a similar basis by the Scottish Government. Now, members will be aware, particularly if they were in the Chamber just last week, that when it comes to challenging the Scottish Government, I certainly don't pull my punches when it comes to challenging the SNP. But I think it would be only fair to acknowledge, as the Chief Secretary ought to have done, that one of the big differences between the Scottish Government's approach and the UK Government's approach is the exemption of pension strain payments from the cap, which I think, as we've heard from many representations from trade unions, representatives of chief executives in local government, I think is one of the key problems and one of the key challenges when it comes to implementing these recommendations. But of course, that's not the only one. Without index linking, the threshold will slowly reduce in real terms, catching more and more public sector workers within its scope. This is setting in motion a steady ratchet on public sector workers. If a cap is necessary, and the Chief Secretary has outlined this case on many occasions in the past, it would be right for it to be linked to public sector pay, so there isn't an erosion in the level of cap in real terms. This is presented as an attempt to exercise restraint on payments to the very highest paid public sector workers. But again, as we've seen from so many of the responses and representations made from trade unions, who are not, by the way, famous for defending excessive levels of high pay, but are absolutely steadfast in defending public sector workers who are paid ordinary and in some cases even modest level of pay. As they highlight, this isn't simply something that will affect the highest paid workers. I think it's catching an awful lot of ordinary workers on ordinary levels of pay as a direct result of the inclusion of pension strain payments within the cap. If the government's intent is simply to prevent higher paid workers being paid large severance payments, a simple index-linked earnings level exemption would provide that without most of the problems that these waivers create. As has already been raised by my honourable friend, the member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark, there's no equality impact assessment for the scheme, and the list of included and exempted bodies also raises concerns. Why are the judiciary exempted but not staff of the Crown Prosecution Service? These elements of the justice system have very different demographic profiles for their staff. And certainly we've heard very strongly from the TUC, the decision not to undertake a comprehensive equality impact assessment does give serious cause for concerns, and they are of the view that the government may well be in breach of its obligations under the Public Sector Equality Duty. The GMB Union argued at the time of the Treasury's 2016 Equality Impact Assessment that was seriously deficient. It is now also out of date. They are also concerned about the Public Sector Equality Duty. The Chief Secretary mentions the waiver process. It seems to me to be cumbersome and over-centralised, with all decisions by local authorities needing to be approved by the Treasury. Now, I would have thought, given some of the examples of public sector waste and profligacy as a result of government incompetence and bad management of contracts that we outlined just this morning, the Chief Secretary would welcome some of his time being freed up to try and make sure that more of the taxpayers' money is more wisely spent. Maybe these regulations might keep his eyes focused on the wrong issues, so we end up in a position where the Treasury is penny wise but billions of pounds foolish when it comes to some of the spending commitments and priorities that the Treasury has outlined only in recent weeks and months. But even though it's Labour online conference week, we won't dwell too much on that, Sir Christopher, because you will no doubt rule me out of scope, and rightly so. Going back to the ongoing consultation led by MHCLG on the changes to the local government pension scheme necessary to give effect to this. If Parliament approves this regulation now, local government employers will find it difficult to agree redundancy packages with staff and unions in the meantime due to concerns about the legality of the exit payments. A £95,000 cash payment and no access to pension is not permitted with the regulations governing early access to unreduced pension in the local government pension schemes. There's also a wider point here, which is local government unions, and I should say at this point, having been in local government as an elected member, I'm also a member of Unison, which represents members in local government. Local government unions have, in their collective bargaining on pay and conditions, deliberately favoured positive pension concerns and priorities over other issues. Local government workers have given up on other benefits to keep these pension terms. These regulations are an arbitrary attack on terms that have been secured through agreement between unions and employers. The regulations also provide an adequate recognition of contractual notice periods. Although they exempt up to 3 months of pay in lieu of notice, the government will know that some public sector staff are contractually entitled to 6 months of notice. COP3 settlements, which are ACAS-arranged compromise settlements, are mostly included in the scope of the cap, but not employment tribunal awards. This will have the utterly perverse effect of incentivising people to go to tribunal and flies in the face of the government's push towards early conciliation, creating a much more costly process for everyone in the process. I think it would be helpful, particularly following an earlier intervention by my honourable friend, just to clear up this issue around settlements in discrimination cases and how they are treated, and also for the Chief Secretary to elaborate on why health and safety settlements are not exempted from the cap. They are unlimited if people go to tribunal, and I think the government needs to clear up where exactly they stand in relation to settlements in discrimination cases and also health and safety settlements as well. They're both treated as unlimited if people take it to employment tribunal. As we've already argued, the inclusion of pension strain costs means that long-serving workers on lower salaries will be caught out, not just the highest paid. In fact, if we take some of the figures and the examples presented by the Local Government Association on the LGA's estimate of the methodology for calculating pension strain costs, the cap of £95,000 would hit as a result of the pension strain issue. Some of the following examples of people leaving with a severance payment. So, for example, a woman leaving the scheme at age 55 on the 31st of March 2019 after 35 years service, earning £23,500, not a particularly large amount of money, with a severance payment based on statutory weeks times actual weekly pay times 1.5. If we move on to people leaving with a redundancy payment, they highlight, for example, a woman leaving the scheme at age 55 on the 31st of March 2019 after 35 years of service, earning £25,100 with a redundancy payment based on a maximum weekly pay of £525. So this idea that it's only targeting the highest paid public sector workers just simply doesn't hold water. And I think there are some basic questions here about fairness and impact, bearing in mind that, it's no good members standing on their front doorstep clapping for their fellow residents on their street and getting their mobile phone out and enjoying a few retweets clapping public sector workers, if in the middle of the pandemic we arrive back here in Parliament to attack the conditions of the very public sector workers who are supporting our country through this crisis. So for those reasons, we cannot support the government. We will be opposing this statutory instrument, and we think it is a source of deep regret that the government has listened, as the Chief Secretary said, to some concerns, but not addressed some of the fundamental ones we've raised this afternoon.
Yeah. Ask the Chief Secretary to respond.
Well, thank you.
Excuse me, did Patricia Gibson wish to speak?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and be brief, Chair. I support what's been said by the previous member who's concerned about the quality impact assessments and how this has unintentional consequences that have not yet been addressed. And while nobody, the SNP or probably any other party, has any objection to the general principle of a public sector exit payment cap, I note this instrument before us here today. The concern about the waivers in the cases of unfair dismissal or health and safety related detriment, and the waiver process is concerning. But the SNP does not, and I certainly do not, support the statutory instrument, which is singularly unfair to those in the nuclear decommissioning industry. Now, we know those workers have suffered cuts to their pensions in the recent past, and this is a cause of profound concern to all those in that industry, not least in my own constituency of those employed in Hunterston in North Ayrshire and Arran. Now, some history, Mr Chair, if you'll give me a bit of latitude, some history here is actually very important. When the nuclear estate was privatised in the 1980s, guarantees were given by the Tory government under Margaret Thatcher. Guarantees were made requiring the new private sector employers to continue to provide pension benefits for those employed at the time of privatisation. And the phrase used at the time was, at least as good as those they were receiving in the public sector. Now, while we've had revisions of the pension arrangements of nuclear decommissioning workers on more than one occasion in fairly recent years, we know this commitment has been abandoned, and now there's the prospect of these exit cap payments. Now, the UK Government has decided that because the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority is classified as public sector, these schemes fall under public sector arrangements, but clearly these pensions are not public sector pensions. Decommissioning sites are now in the private sector, and unlike for every other public sector worker, redundancy is an inherent part of their job. Now, the Minister seems to have said today, and he seems to have put it on the record, that all nuclear decommissioning workers will be exempted from the public sector exit payments cap. Now, we should have had sight of that commitment. If that is his commitment, if I've understood him correctly, we should have had that commitment long before now. And we should have had commitments and guarantees to employees of Magnox Limited and others affected by the Enterprise Act 2016. Now, I know that Magnox is specifically mentioned in this document here. So, the way that I read this, the provisions on relaxing the cap contained within the regulations are not adequate and not sufficient to give comfort to nuclear decommissioning workers that they are indeed exempted in the way that I know the Minister wishes that they want to be and they should be. The regulations should be drawn specifically to exclude those workers in nuclear decommissioning. I would like to see more specificity on that. And it seems that because of that lack of specificity, we've been asked to agree on something here today in which there is a lack of clarity from what I can see. Now, we know that nuclear decommissioning workers, we know they do a very highly skilled job. We know their job is sometimes dangerous, but to be caught up after all the cuts to their pensions in recent years, again, in regards to attacks on their pensions on these public sector exit payment regulations is not acceptable. And it is creating, as we speak, disincentives for people to work, to be recruited and indeed to stay in that industry. And it's extremely bad for morale. Now, nuclear decommissioning workers have contacted me, and I know will have contacted anybody who's got a nuclear plant in their constituency. They are concerned, and I'm sorry to say that when it comes to their pensions, they are right to be concerned, because it can be seen that the agreements that they thought they had with the UK Government over several decades, it can be seen that those guarantees are not being honoured. And when I raised this with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury 2 years ago, I was told, and I quote, "It is necessary to have terms and conditions that reflect the modern situation that applies across the economy as a whole." How does that square with the cast iron guarantees made to these workers when the nuclear estate was privatised? They were not told that these cast iron guarantees were actually written on water. The problem is these workers are classed as public sector workers, but their terms and conditions are not devolved to the Scottish Parliament as they are for other public sector workers. Scottish nuclear workers still have their severance and early retirement terms dictated by the UK Government. The goalposts have clearly been moved when it is deemed financially beneficial for the Government or the industry, while the pension interests of the workers always seem to be a secondary consideration. And the Office for National Statistics has classed Magnox as a public sector organisation, despite the fact that they work on sites that have privatised. Now, draft guidance from the Government uses the definition of a public authority contained in the Freedom of Information Act, which includes bodies specifically listed in schedules to the Acts, publicly owned companies and any other body designed as a public authority by the Secretary of State. Interestingly, Magnox is not listed in the schedules, and that is because it is privately and not publicly owned. Consequently, the Freedom of Information Act does not apply to Magnox, except where stipulated in employee contracts with the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, and so neither do the IR35 reforms. So we have confusion and concern among nuclear decommissioning workers, and that continues, and it's not acceptable. So as we pontificate over these exit payment caps, I urge the Minister to remember that any changes, any further attacks on these workers is a betrayal of the guarantees that they have had. So we've been told today of waivers or exemptions. I'm not even quite sure what the Minister's suggesting. But Magnox's inclusion in Part 1 of these regulations makes anything that he says now equivocal. What we need is a clear statement. These measures will not impact on nuclear decommissioning workers. It's a simple ask, and it's a yes or no answer, Mr Chair, so I'm looking forward to the Minister giving me that yes or no answer. Thank you.
Chief Secretary.
Thank you, Sir Christopher, and thank you to colleagues for their engagement in this debate. As I have already remarked, the government is strongly of the view that these regulations are important in delivering value for money. It's right that a cap on public sector exit payments comes into force without further delay to stop the excessive payouts that are unfortunately all too common. Now, the Honourable Lady asked me to clarify the position of nuclear decommissioning, which indeed has been an issue that has been much debated. Indeed, it was debated extensively, you recall, Sir Christopher, during the passage of the primary legislation, where there was extensive debates about the inclusion of nuclear decommissioning workers in the scope of these regulations. And as we have set out many times, most recently by ensuring the cap covers all of the public sector at once, this cap should apply to all public sector organisations with very limited exemptions. And the defining feature of that is what is set by the Office of National Statistics. So we are able to exercise our own judgment, but for the most part the scope has been guided by the Office for National Statistics, and is the ONS that makes objective judgments independent from government and also of these regulations. And it's based on the ONS classification that the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority and its site licence companies are in the scope of the regulations, but we have a mechanism to waive certain pension-related payments upon redundancy, and that is what has been decided, and that is what I was reading out for the benefit of the Honourable Lady. So in short, Sir Christopher, taking this specific point on decommissioning, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority has a waiver, but the bodies, the organisation, is classified by the Office of National Statistics, and that is why it's within the scope of the cap. So that is the interaction between the two. Now, the Honourable Gentleman sort of started by, I think, generously acknowledging that we have listened and addressed some issues of concern. I think there's some areas of misunderstanding. So an equalities impact assessment was issued with the primary legislation, so that's when that was issued. But he then both said that on the one hand we don't need this legislation and these regulations, but on the other hand that he was against excessive payments. And I would argue that the whole purpose of these regulations is to curb the excessive payments that I think actually he and I and a number of colleagues across the House agree are not value for money. Now, the Honourable Gentleman raised specifically the issue of local... Well, I can take the intervention before I answer his question, if that's how I answer the both at the same time.
I appreciate the Chief Secretary giving way. If the Chief Secretary believes these issues are resolved, why then has the British Medical Association, the organisation that represents those health workers he's clapped on Thursday, already sought to take a judicial review out against these regulations because they extend the scope of the enabling statute? How do you square that circle in preventing some contractually agreed payments and tribunal awards? BMA is saying this is an unlawful extension of the primary legislation.
Well, the reality, without wanting to stray into an issue of litigation, the reality is this is a cap on payments, and therefore a body representing the members may have concerns about that. But the issue before the committee today is what constitutes value for money for the taxpayer. And I remind the committee of the fact that this is more than 6 times the national living wage. This is 4 times the average earnings. And I think at a time of coronavirus, these are very substantial payments. And I can read, and Sir Christopher, you will be familiar with some of the payments that were read out on the floor of the House of NHS managers, for example, receiving very large payments and then reappearing elsewhere in the NHS very shortly. I give one further and then I'll make some progress.
Where's Stephen?
Well, I'm grateful to the Chief Secretary for giving way, and of course it's easy to point to those examples. I'm just wondering how the 6-figure payoff to Mark Sedwell could have been considered taxpayer value for money, and how much the wider cull of top civil servants under this government is costing the taxpayer.
So, well, I think I was going to come on to local authorities, but to address the issue of senior civil servants, which the Honourable Gentleman raises, that flowed from the decision to split the Cabinet Secretary and the head of the Civil Service role with that of his other role, which is the National Security Advisor, which meant that Sir Mark was stepping down before the end of his tenure. It was therefore appropriate that Sir Mark was compensated in line with the Civil Service Compensation Scheme, and the sum is in line with the normal rules governing civil service pensions and compensation. And since 2015, and in anticipation of the introduction of a cross-public sector cap on exit payments, any civil service exit costing more than £95,000 requires approval by Cabinet Office Ministers in order to ensure that it provides value for money to the taxpayer. And as someone who worked with Sir Mark, particularly in my role as Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, may I place on record, Sir Christopher, what a fine public service he was and how much I valued working with him during his time in office. The Honourable Gentleman, I would say in a number of interventions, if that's not untoward, also raised a legitimate point around local authorities, and as I say, it is something I looked at in particular. And local authorities' ability to restructure should not be dependent on six-figure taxpayer-funded payouts. Councils will still be able to restructure and exit staff in any way they wish, providing the sum of any exit payment doesn't exceed £95,000. And the government does accept that there may be instances where it is in the interests of urgent workforce reform to relax the restrictions imposed by these regulations. So there is flexibility within the system for that. And finally, Sir Christopher, the Honourable Gentleman raised the issue of index linking. And the point is that we want to retain the flexibility to revalue the cap both upwards but also downwards. And I think if one looks at the economic consequences of coronavirus, ensuring that there is flexibility in the system is a prudent way to manage the public finances. That's why, Sir Christopher, just right at the final moment, but of course to the Honourable Lady.
I'm very, very grateful, and I've listened very carefully to everything he said, and I appreciate the arguments that he has put forward. But I just wanted to put on record that we should remember that in a time of COVID, which we are in, many of the people who will be affected by these changes are people on relatively moderate salaries who have given years of their life dedicated to public service and will be giving everything to help get through this COVID crisis as well. And so just to put on record that it is vital that the government keep this measure linked, index linked, so that it doesn't erode over time and all the promises that he has made today do not become meaningless within a few years.
Well, as I say, and I acknowledged in a previous speech, the Honourable Lady, given that she accepted the principle of capping excessive payments, but raised some concerns on the House, which I'd listened to intently. I join with her in paying tribute to the work that so many have done across the public sector, but it is important at the same time we get value for money. It is for that reason, Sir Christopher, I commend this motion to the House.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft restriction of public sector exit payments regulations 2020. As many opinions say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. Division. I deem the doors to have been locked.
Ben Mathalomi. Stephen Barclay.
Aye.
Felicity Buchan.
Aye.
Neil Coyle. No. Chris Evans.
No.
Patricia Gibson.
No.
Catherine McKinnell.
No.
Sherilyn McCrory.
Aye.
Robbie Moore.
Aye.
Avana Obongasari.
No.
Dean Russell.
Aye.
David Rockley.
Aye.
Jeff Smith.
No.
Jane Stevenson.
Aye.
Wes Streeting.
No.
Matt Vickers.
Aye.
Craig Williams.
Aye.
Thank you. Ayes 10, noes 7. So the ayes have it. Order, order, and unlock.